Hello and welcome to this special live event for Oxford Word of the Year 2024. Thank you so much for everyone who's joined us. I'm your host, Susie Dent. I have been working with Oxford Dictionary since 1992, which was also the year I joined Countdown as a word referee in the corner. Although, as many people pointed out, it's not actually a corner, and nor does the clock count down, but that is an entirely different story. My involvement with the Word of the Year began soon after, and it remains one of the very best and certainly the most thought-provoking elements of my job, because it never fails to ignite passion, interest, even disgust on occasion. But that passion is proof that we care enormously about our language and have very strong views about the directions we are choosing to take it in. And that we is important because there is no committee presiding over our language. It is a democracy. And much as some would like a linguistic government, we all are it. And that, as you'll hear, is the story of every Oxford Word of the Year and its selection. And I am joined by some wonderful experts who know far more about this than me. And I'm going to ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves as well. Casper, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm Casper Grothel. I'm the president of Oxford Languages. I've been with OUP for over 25 years. Susie and I overlapped in reference and dictionaries for a brief period, which was a really golden age for me. And I'm really pleased to be here.
Thank you. Catherine, hello.
Hi, I'm Catherine Martin. I'm product director for Oxford Dictionaries, and I've been here for 21 years, starting as an OED editor back in 2003.
Thank you. And Fiona, last but not least.
Hi, I'm Fiona McPherson. I'm a senior editor with the New Words team on the Oxford English Dictionary. And let's just say I have over 2 decades worth of experience at OUP. But yeah, I'm very pleased to be here and take part in this annual shebang.
Yes, shebang it is, and it is a fascinating one. And also, I should just say thank you to everyone who has actually submitted suggestions for their Word of the Year and contenders that you've been sharing on social. Some of the ones that you've submitted include books, which I think is absolutely wonderful. Should be that every year. Unhinged, probably won't explore that one too much. Tired, chronically online, amelioration, all fascinating ones, and do keep them coming. But over the next hour, we're going to hear from this brilliant panel about the significance of the Word of the Year, this 20-year milestone that 2024 brings, and then share what you were waiting for, which is Oxford's approach this year. Really importantly, please do share your questions in the course of the discussion, because that is often the very best bit, and we'll have some time to put those questions to our panel later in the event. But let's get started. And it is always worth, I think, having a brief overview of the history of Word of the Year and what it's all about. And there is no one better really to tell us about this, because as you've heard, she's been involved for a very long time, been with Oxford University Press for over 2 decades. Catherine, can you tell? Oh, actually, I've got that wrong, because that was you, Fiona, wasn't it? But Catherine, how long have you been with OUP? 2 decades as well.
21.
I think I lost some audio there. Is it good news again?
Well, Catherine, you've been with us for a very long time. I mean, I think this is such a wonderful place to work that once you're there, you never want to leave. And I mean that, even though I did have to leave at some point. But Catherine, can you tell us more about an event that has gained more and more attention over the years, really, and the aims behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as we've established, the 4 of us were all around in 2004, but probably many of the people who are listening won't. So I'd like to start by taking us back in time to 2004. Tony Blair was Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. In the United States, George W. Bush was narrowly reelected as president over Democratic candidate John Kerry. Mobile phones had physical buttons and tiny screens. Cameras were just becoming a common feature, but they had very, very poor quality. And we used the term megapixel a lot at that time, as we were starting to finally get these functional cameras on our phones. We didn't have smartphones. MySpace was the most prominent social media website. Facebook had just been launched as the Facebook, but it was only available to university students. Reddit didn't exist, and neither did Twitter. And most dictionary usage was happening in physical books. So although there were digital dictionaries out there, handheld devices, CD-ROMs, something that some people may remember, and and we did have some websites like OED.com, but it was a really different time. And I think it can be easy to forget that there's a lot of things that we have today that we didn't have back then. And there are a lot of words that we have today that we didn't have in 2004. And I'll just give a selection of some of these that I think some are hard to believe we didn't have. App Store, airplane mode, bucket list, crowdsourcing, fintech, promposal.
I've not heard that one.
Binge watching, cake pop, live streamer, gig economy, and jeggings. So those are all things, all things that you can say that word today and someone will know what you mean. And if you had said those sounds in 2004, someone probably wouldn't have known what you were talking about.
I don't want to know what that like rogues gallery of words says about where we're going, but I find it really, really satisfying for you to list those things out that were not pre-2004.
I agree, but I have to say, can we bin jeggings, please, in every aspect?
I believe that Gen Z has done that.
Good.
So I'm told. So it was a different world, and I wanted to set that scene because I think it's important context for understanding, well, at least one aspect of the early years of our Word of the Year program that seems unusual today, which is that we often had separate US and UK words. Language is very personal and local, so obviously even today there are significant differences between US and UK vocabulary and accents. We all know this. And there are also differences in the specific preoccupations in a given year between the US and the UK, which will make one word resonate more than another. But nowadays, there's such a global media and social media environment that we live in that the idea of having separate words seems very confusing, I think. It seems really natural that we now tend to have one global word of the year. And we tend now to look for a word that has global relevance. But I think there's also an aspect, which is that our lexicography program and the way that we look at and examine language has become much more global in its approach to documenting the English language as it exists and as it's changing. And we really emphasize looking at all of the diverse varieties of English that are spoken in so many countries around the world. And so that US and UK binary seems very simplistic from the perspective of 2024. But with that being said, the first word of the year was in 2004, and it was UK only, and they picked a very UK word, chav. And for many years after that, we had two words, one US and one UK. They weren't always particularly culturally distinct. So in 2005, the US word was podcast, and the UK word was Sudoku, both of which have held up and stood the test of times. But they were the things that resonated in those countries, and we kind of publicized them and talked about them separately. But the last year that we had separate UK, US, and US words of the year was 2012. And that was when the US team selected GIF as a verb, and the UK selected omnishamble. So believe it or not, like that was the peak of putting GIFs into like responses and on social media and posts. You had to be there. But in 2013, we had a unanimous choice, and that was really a breakout year in a number of ways. That was the year of selfie. So obviously, phone cameras had gotten much better since 2004, and we were taking pictures of ourselves with them all the time. And this was one of the first years when we really focused on the statistical aspect of the choice. OUP prides itself on its language monitoring program. And so it's always been essential that there be something novel about the word of the year choice, whether it was actually new or newly prominent. We're always looking for that change in usage in that year. But in 2013, we really looked at the statistical evidence in our corpus, and it showed this just absolutely extraordinary growth of selfie going from like 0 to 60,000 in a short period of time. So that was a real breakout hit. But that scenario of a single word skyrocketing into common usage in 1 year is really the exception and not the rule. So sometimes we found that the most impactful way to express how language is changing in a given year actually isn't to choose a word at all. And so that's happened twice. In 2015, instead of choosing a word, we chose the face with tears of joy emoji.
Oh, that was I just remember the grief that we got for that one.
Oh my God, that was
It's not a word.
It was so controversial that it just a lot of conversations started about language as a result of that, which I found really engaging.
Yes, I remember it well.
Yeah, very, very controversial, but I think that very controversy like helped get at what was so resonant about that, which was that was a time when emoji were becoming much more prominent in written communication, and people were like, is English going to cease to exist? Are we all going to just communicate in pictograms all the time? And it hasn't yet happened yet, but it is definitely the case that we all use images in our written communication, naturally, and we have this, and there's this new symbolic element that when we're communicating online, that's different. Yeah, I think that was something that we now can look back and say, 2015 inflection point there. And then the other year,
Catherine, there was a moment I remember in 2015 when we were looking at the short list and someone had said, well, emoji is a really, good word. And I can't remember who said it, when someone said, yeah, but what would get people talking is if we actually picked an emoji. And I remember when the room went silent of like, oh my God, could we dare to do that? It was a fun time.
Yeah, definitely. The FAQs that year were like, is an emoji a word was one of the big things.
I think we kept talking about Egyptian hieroglyphs, if I remember.
Yeah.
But it spiked, so as you say, so strongly on our linguistic graphs. I think in retrospect now, it seems so insightful to me as a choice, and such a good choice. But yeah, a few waves at the time.
Yeah, and so then in 2020, we also didn't choose a single word of the year because we instead offered a report on the words in plural of an unprecedented year to express the immense impact of COVID and the fact like this was not a year like normal years. For us globally, as speakers of all languages, there was something different about this year. And so again, when you look back, and we're always thinking about the word of the year in the specific year, but when you kind of see them all put together, it's these kind of aberrations that I think jump out at you and show you something that was going on. Beyond that, I think there's been one more big change that we can look at in how the word of the year has evolved over time, which was in 2022. And that was the first year that we offered the public the chance to weigh in on the word of the year choice. And the word that was chosen that year was goblin mode. So those are things that have changed in the word of the year, but just briefly, I'd also think it's worth looking at some of the common threads that have stayed the same. Every year we have a short list of potential candidates as well as that single choice. And so if you look at those all together, there are some really clear themes that come through. Words relating to climate and the environment have been consistent throughout those 2 decades. I think almost every year there's been at least one word that's touching on those points. And in 2019, the entire shortlist, as well as the word of the year, were climate related. New technology is also a through line for word of the year. I mean, in general, like we're usually changing the way we speak in reaction to something that's happening in society, or just for novelty. But often the things that come for the world of the year are going to be the things that really resonate with bigger social changes. So new technology really and science drive that. And there's usually at least one new or newly prominent word that's related to scientific or technical innovation. Political discourse through the years has generated a lot of candidates, but I have to say that I think those are the ones that when you look back, they seem like they haven't stood the time as well often.
Yeah. I remember here in the UK, we had squeezed middle, which was a big thing at the time. I haven't heard that phrase. I don't know whether Fiona has, but for a very long time. But that is such a fascinating overview, Catherine. And looking at the inspirations and the trends. I also remember, as you say, during the pandemic, I think everyone was saying, please don't choose unprecedented as the word, because they were so tired of it by the time they came to Oxford.
We got it in there.
We did, but it wasn't the single one, which I think was really good. Fiona, I know your personal favorite over the 20 years is selfie, and you did a huge amount of work on that. But have they all had the same staying power, or have some of them been like linguistic mayflies and just sort of disappeared after a very short time?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that they haven't all had the same staying power. You just mentioned squeeze middle, and that is actually one of the few. If you look at all of the choices, both the US ones when there were 2 and other ones, that is one of the very few that haven't actually ended up going into one of our dictionaries.
Yeah. But
I'd argue that doesn't matter. Staying power is not an integral part of what makes a good word of the year at all. A word of the year can burn really brightly and then, disappear as quickly as it came onto the stage, if you like. And that's okay. In some ways, that makes it an even better candidate, you could argue, for word of the year, because it's saying something about that year, that time, that thing that was maybe not necessarily uniting everybody, because it's very difficult to find one word that everybody is going to, it's going to resonate with everybody and everyone's going to think, oh, yes, that says something to me about my life. But that's okay. As I say, we're not looking at, it's not word of the year to be included in a dictionary sometime soon, or word of the year that is already in a dictionary. But even thinking about, as I said, most of them, squeeze middle being an example of one that didn't actually make it, and most of them have actually had a real massive amount of staying power. You mentioned selfie being my favorite. Yes, selfie is probably my favorite. Possibly because, as Catherine alluded to, that was the year that I think word of the year went stratospheric almost. There was always an interest in it because people are interested in words. People use words. Language is the kind of basis, if you like, of all of our communication, however we use it, or in whichever form we're using it. But it was really 2013 when we chose selfie that everybody just seemed to really get in on the act. I can remember, though, some people saying, I've never heard of it, which was quite surprising. And some people saying, oh, I don't like it. And really what they didn't like was the ubiquitous nature of the fact that people were always taking selfies. It was that behavior they didn't like rather than the word itself.
Yes.
So I think that, I don't think anybody would be arguing that selfies have gone away. But another one, if you think of podcast, which was the 2005 choice in the US, as it turns out, and although, as Catherine said, that and Sudoku could easily have been, the other way around. That really is the kind of the medium of choice now for an awful lot of people and how they get their news or their entertainment. But I can remember, that was 2005 we chose it. I can remember there being a time a few years ago where people were talking about the death of podcasts and how they were passé and nobody podcasts anymore. That's kind of not really the case, and they're very, very much at the forefront of how a lot of people are consuming news and, as I said, and their entertainment. One other one that I think has had staying power, but we may not have necessarily thought it would have at the time, was Omnishambles. That was a year before selfie. Yeah. Now that was one where we actually knew the coinage because it was from the thick of it.
Yeah.
The satirical BBC, comedy, or maybe not comedy, but you can decide whether or not you think it's a bit too realistic to be actual comedy. That took a little bit more time. It was around because everybody was talking about not at the time probably political contexts, situations being completely chaotic and all of that kind of thing. But it branched out and it became used of any kind of chaotic situation. It probably, I think it's fair to say, took a little bit more time to become embedded. I think we added that to the WOTY. It was maybe something like 2019, something like that. So it took a little bit longer. But again, some are meteoric, some are slightly slow burners, and some just, don't really go anywhere. But it definitely stuck around, and you see people talking about Omnishambles even today. So those are three examples.
That's a nice euphemism for a slightly ruder version as well, which I think is helpful.
Yes.
I probably won't say, but it's always useful to have something that's a bit more family friendly, isn't it?
Yes.
Three examples then of words which have definitely demonstrated that staying power, even if not every single choice always has.
Fascinating. Thank you. If we have time, I will also ask Catherine and Caspar for their absolute favourites. But actually, Caspar, you I have an inkling. I think I might know what it is, but let's move on to this year. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this year's word will be selected? Because I think that's why everyone is here.
Well, so we, as Catherine had said, we had a really overwhelming response to opening up the Word of the Year process to have the public have a participatory element to it, so that people could, vote on the words that they think resonate the most, that are personally to them, feel like it captured the year. It was really successful. And that marrying of our language expertise, as we monitor a language all year, we look at statistics, we look at the variety of factors that are in our corpus around how words are evolving and changing over the year, and then marrying that with the public's kind of view around those contenders. It's been a really successful process for us. We think it says, you said at the beginning, our language is a democratic institution, and when people are able to not just have a conversation about the word of the year, but also feel like they have input into the word of the year, it makes it personal, and language is personal. So this year, what we've decided to do is continue with that tradition now that we've established around opening it up. We, of course, track language, and all year long, we've got our watch lists of potential shortlist words. We're seeing how what kind of attention they get, how frequency is spiking. We've come up with a list of 6 words this year that we think are really good to be on a short list, that have the potential to really be a winner in that word of the year category. And so now we're going to be opening that up to the public so that we can get their views. Not only will people be allowed to vote on it, but we're interested in the conversations that happen around the short list, and so we can get that perspective. And then in early December, we will be making a final selection of Oxford's Word of the Year. So that's the process we're going to go through this year, and we're all really excited about it.
We are, and that final selection will be based both on our democratic votes from the users that can participate in this, but also you mentioned the corpus there. Maybe worth explaining what that corpus is, because for me, despite its slightly alienating title, it is the most exciting thing in the world.
We have, one of the ways in which we look at maintaining all of our lexical or language resources is corpus-based analysis. It's evidence-based. It's around how we all are using language, and the corpus captures that. It's billions of words that are pulled from social media and news reports and the newspaper and all kinds of other places, transcripts, all
novels.
Yes, exactly. Novels,
Yeah.
all evidence of language that in the way it's being used. And it's a balanced corpus to make sure that it's got representation of various types of language, of regions. So, we can identify if something is primarily Australian use or Canadian use. And, so this corpus we point some very powerful tools at this corpus that allow us to interrogate the language and what is happening in it. The corpus is updated continually, so it's very current, and we can see trends both in terms of usage and, as I said, location and geography and tone. We can understand things about its connotations and the collocates, the words that are most often used with that word, which tells us a lot about how people are experiencing and thinking about the sense and how it's evolving. So the corpus is a really powerful tool, and that having that along with kind of public views around language, I feel like it brings really 2 expert facets together. Us as users, we are the professional experts of English, along with the evidence-based story that allows us to make sure that we can look underneath the hood of what's happening to language.
Yeah, I like that metaphor. That's lovely. And yes, the friends that words keep are so important in sort of, charting their trajectory. But it is time, I think, to reveal the contenders that the public will be voting for. So let us introduce the first 2 contenders for the Oxford Word of the Year 2024. Brain rot is our first. Brain rot. Some of you may be very familiar with this. I certainly am. This is the supposed deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, especially viewed as a result of overconsumption of material, now particularly online content, considered to be trivial or unchallenging. And it can also be applied to something characterized as likely to lead to such deterioration. And number 2 is slop. Really good example of a word being repurposed. Slop is art, writing, or other content generated using artificial intelligence, which is then shared and distributed online in an indiscriminate or intrusive way and characterized as being of low quality, inauthentic, or inaccurate. Well, we all want to know why these have been selected as contenders for the Oxford Word of the Year. You've heard a little bit about our selection process, but Catherine, can you elaborate for us on why these 2?
Glad to. So, both of these words point to a really strong trend that we see in the preoccupations of people around the world this year, which is anxiety about the balance between humanity and technology. But they're kind of getting at that anxiety in different ways. So with brain rot, we see this concern about how our capacity for thought might be negatively impacted by consuming a lot of algorithmic online content like short form video. And there's an anxiety coming through about striking the right balance between the online world and the real world, and losing touch with the real world. I think it's great that young people also use this term to refer to the type of language used by people who overindulge in online content, which is wonderfully sort of recursive and self-referential. But this is a word that's undeniably shot up in usage in the past year. It has shown us about a 250% increase in our corpus. But as is often the case, when we look into it more deeply, we find an extensive and perhaps unexpected history. So I was delighted when the research team told us that this term was apparently first used by Henry David Thoreau in 1854 in Walden.
Wow.
The quote is, "While England endeavors to cure the potato rot, will not any endeavor to cure the brain rot, which prevails so much more widely and fatally." So this is just one of these wonderful things that we discover when we look back into the history of language, where we see this is a metaphor that was already resonating back in the 19th century of people's minds atrophying or warping. And in the 20th century, we see the term brain rot being used to refer to, for example, the impact of television and other popular culture. So these fears are consistent, but what's changed this year is it's being used much more specifically and consistently with reference to this particular trend in online culture. So that's why brain rot.
Yes.
We're seeing a different angle on that anxiety. So we see Slop breaking out this year with reference to this low quality or strange and uncanny content created by generative AI that's seen as flooding the internet. And there's maybe some concern here about generative AI displacing or draining out human creativity. And this, again, obviously, slop is not a new word; it's an old word. And we look back, we can see that actually a similar use of slop has existed for quite some time. So it was used to refer to cultural material from at least the mid-19th century. That's kind of cultural material that's regarded as not of high quality. So that might have been overly sentimental literature back in the day, but now we're seeing this like kind of coalesce into this idea of AI slop, this just like large amount of content that is just unsatisfying, unnourishing, is
washing over us.
And I think it's interesting. You can see there's a little bit of a resonance here with the word spam. Which is also like referring to this kind of hollow nature of a certain type of, in that case, human-created content, but that's created for a purpose that does not have high integrity. So that's AI Slop getting us at more of that artificial intelligence angle. And looking at those two words together, I think you can see this continuation of what's a long-term standing trend for the word of the year, which is that internet culture and media have been a consistent theme. And we're seeing that continue today. And if we look back on the last 2 decades, I think it's not surprising there have been, really huge and momentous changes in how we relate to each other through online means, and how we exist in the real world and in the online world, and how we balance between those things. So this seems both in keeping with past word of the year choices, but also really distinctive in about 2024 and what's going on this year.
Thank you. Well, that's not the most joyful of starts in terms of the words. Let's see if the next two are a little bit more positive. Here are number 3 and 4. Okay, well, romantasy. This is a noun that means a genre of fiction combining elements of romantic fiction and fantasy, typically featuring themes of magic, the supernatural, or adventure, alongside a central romantic storyline. Romantasy. Next, we have dynamic pricing. Who's not heard of dynamic pricing this year? This is the practice of varying the price for a product or service to reflect changing market conditions, and in particular, the charging of a higher price at a time of greater demand. Fiona, over to you. I think the second one fairly self-explanatory, but tell us about both of these.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll start in the order that you've got them here with romantasy. I think that, as Catherine kind of alluded to with what she was saying, I think there's a unifying theme of many of these words, and that could be there's nothing new under the sun. A lot of these words have been repurposed or enjoyed a greater prominence, even if they were actually words that were quite well established or concepts that they were. But romantasy is one that's a little bit newer, even if it's not brand new to 2024. It's one in terms of introduction to English language, it's a little bit newer. The first evidence we've got of it in use comes from 2008, when it was used as a genre label by a Random House in Germany, actually, for a German translation of an English romantic fantasy novel. It didn't really take off. There were a few people commenting on it, but it didn't sort of break out or anything like that. A couple of years later, there's some evidence on social media of people using the term to refer to this genre. But it took a bit of a gradual increase and until the last 12 months, where it really seems to have gone quite mainstream. It's been used over 8 times more in the last 12 months than it had been previously. Now, thinking about the word itself, one of the mantras of lexicography is everybody loves a blend. And that's what romantasy is, yes, in its origins. It's, etymologically speaking, it's a blend of the words romance and fantasy, both of them, of course, genres in their own right. And blends often have a kind of feeling of being new and novel and maybe fun or even spontaneous, but actually a lot of them will stick around for quite a long time.
Am I right in thinking?
Sorry, think about other terms.
Sorry, no, sorry, there was a delay there.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. Am I right in thinking? I know when I was closer to the coalface, I just heard or read that portmanteau are the most productive. Well, that is creating a portmanteau is the most productive mechanism at the moment. It's the sort of number one process behind neologisms. I don't know if that's still the case.
I don't know if it definitely be. I don't know if it would definitely be number one. It's going to be up there. Compounding could also be up there, which of course I'm going to come on to talk about.
Sorry, yes.
With my
carry on.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But yeah, everybody loves a blend, and that's why it's such a common way of coming up with new words in English. Yeah. I mean, even in terms of genres, if you think about faction, that's the blend of fact and fiction. Think about things outside of literature. You've got mockumentaries, you've got documentaries, shockumentaries, all those kind of things. So it's something that we like doing, and it seems to work quite well for genres in particular.
Yeah.
But why? Yeah, it's interesting to think about why we're seeing this 8-fold increase now. Well, I think social media has to be a factor. Book talk is a phenomenon, on TikTok, where people are discussing and recommending books to each other. You've also got books of Instagram and that kind of thing. But I think maybe there's a need for escapism. You know, the news cycle can definitely seem like almost relentlessly grim, and sometimes you just want to get away from it with something that's maybe a bit more feel good. And a Romantasy author called Georgia Summers has actually been quoted about the rise of this type of book. And she said that there were sort of another subgenre of fantasy called grim dark. There's another sort of blend. That was popular in the early 2010s, and it was a lot more gritty and dark, things like Game of Thrones. But as she said, we're now seeing the rise of cozy fantasy and romance and fairy tale fantasy. Books have a bit more of an uplifting feel. So that could be part of the reason why we're seeing that, people just looking for something to take them away from the relentlessly grim nature of things.
Yeah.
Which kind of segues neatly maybe into dynamic pricing, funnily enough. Now, again, as a concept, dynamic pricing, it's nothing new. It's been around for decades, used in economic and business contexts, commonly used in transport. You know, you have flight tickets, ride-hailing services, train tickets. Even in the US, it will get you access to faster lanes on some highways. And it's used in online marketplaces. Things will change price multiple times a day in order to maximize profits. And even its use in the entertainment world, which I think is why we're seeing it increasing this year. That's not new. Theatres and cinemas have often varied their prices in order to get people, in and maximize their profits. But this year, it's been especially noticeable, with a particularly high profile instance of it. Hit the headlines this year, certainly in the UK, when fans experienced it directly when they were trying to purchase tickets for the much hyped and anticipated reunion of the British band Oasis. It's more than doubled this year, which may seem more modest than some of the other ones, but for something that's so embedded in culture and that's been around for so long and isn't really a sexy term, is it?
No, we need portmanteau for this one.
Yeah, well,
it does not roll off the tongue.
There is something to say about it, but that I think that's this sort of hitting the ordinary person trying to buy concert tickets. And I think part of the problem was some fans anyway, were in a virtual queue for hours before they were suddenly expected to pay much more than what the face value was. So that raised concerns about transparency and value for money, which probably helped. Now, at first glance, yep, it may seem like a fairly dull formation of a compound in English. It's dynamic and pricing. That's not that exciting. But, and this is what appealed to me as a lexicographer, it's actually more interesting than that, maybe even a little bit dynamic. It's actually a loan word from Swedish, would you believe? My Swedish isn't great. I'll give it a go. Dynamiska prisbildning, which was used by a Swedish economist in 1927. Someone who went on to win the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1974, actually. And then a couple of years later, it was translated into English. The title of the person's book was translated into English as Dynamic Pricing by another Swedish economist. So that, for me, kind of gave it this little bit of an extra lift, I think, because it's not actually quite as bog standard a formation as you like. And I think, just to finish with, I think another reason maybe why dynamic pricing has come under so much scrutiny this year and why we're seeing so much written about it is, there's a continuation of cost of living pressures for so many people in so many places. And if individuals are struggling to make ends meet and cutting back on what they may see as discretional spending, maybe quite a few people are thinking that companies and already rich performers are taking advantage and resent this. So I think that's why dynamic pricing has been such a big deal this year in 2024.
Yeah, tapping into the mood. Thank you very much for that. And I am going to whiz through the last two contenders for Oxford's Word of the Year 2024, and then ask Casper to very briefly speak to them. So let's see them. Okay, wow, these two may be familiar, but not as we know them. The first is law. a body of supposed facts, background information, and anecdotes relating to someone or something regarded as knowledge required for a full understanding or an informed discussion of the subject in question. I thought sure that Casper can simplify that one for us. And demure, of a person, reserved or restrained in appearance or behaviour, of clothing, not showy, ostentatious, or overly revealing. Well, what's new, you might think, but actually the context was, as it turns out, very new. Casper, please, can you help us with these two?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go through this quickly because I want to leave some time to answer some questions. From
yes, I agree.
But, Fiona mentioned that sometimes, there are themes across a year, and it feels like at one point she said, oh, everything old is new again. And I feel like these two words kind of embody that in a certain way. They're old-fashioned words, they're yesteryear words in some ways. And but what's interesting about them is that even though they had faded from contemporary vocabulary, online communities and others, sometimes particularly youth, who are rediscovering and reclaiming some old language and revitalizing it. And you see that it's part of probably what gives these words a bit of frisson this year, is that they're both old-fashioned, but they're also freshly retro, and people are using them in that way that kind of signals that you're up on the now. And and I think that's a really interesting thing. It's also, both these words have the power, the engine that drove them this year is TikTok. And that TikTok is such an interesting, we're in a linguistic moment with TikTok where it is churning out linguistic change, so rapidly with these trends. And I think that's really interesting that both of these words embody. Demure was used by an online influencer, Jules LeBron, who, in the famous phrase from August now, very demure, very mindful, that just exploded, and it was an instant spike, and it was used everywhere. And, and lore is a little different. Lore reminds me a little bit of being related to last year's word of the year, Riz, where it's, that kind of Gen Z, Gen Alpha community online that's kind of driving that. It's been growing over the course of the year. And as you say, these words, the meaning of these words hasn't really changed, the senses of them. It's really the context that's being used. And with lore, I find it really interesting that it's about being used a lot around your own personal histories. And, it's usually around things where you're revealing something that was mysterious or hidden, in a certain way, and that you're kind of bringing out to light, which I think touches back again to like Romantasy and things like that, where there is a certain sense of kind of escapism that you feel like, this past year with, that news cycle and so much political, social events happening, there was a counterbalance to that of feeling like you needed something that was not based in the harsh light of reality. So anyway, these are the kind of stories of those words.
I think that's entirely true. I feel like Tolkien would be very proud of the lore.
Yes, exactly.
There's something quite soothing about them. And Casper, you mentioned Riz. That was my guess as to your favourite. Was I right?
It had been that tears of joy emoji, only because I love a word of the year that makes certain one faction irate and one faction kind of scream in its support. But I think Riz has become my favorite word of the year. I mean, it's fun to say. It's got some swagger and some energy, and it really announced in some ways the kind of arrival of that Gen Alpha, those really young people who are having a outsized influence on linguistic change, as I was saying. And the best part about that was that it started to create a conversation last year that was intergenerational. It was a bridge. It was a communication bridge between generations around language. A lot of older people had never heard of Riz.
No, and they were suddenly asking, have I got Riz? And to this day, actually, I'm not sure whether it's on the turn. Fiona, you might have witnessed this in Catherine, but very briefly. I don't know whether it's the swagger is getting too much now and we've got a bit of a kind of braggart sort of sense of it, or is it still really good if you've got Riz?
I find what's interesting is probably those communities that really adopted and amplified Riz, those young TikTokers, they're probably, now that their grandmothers or parents are saying, oh, what's Riz? Or they're using Riz, I'm sure they have abandoned it immediately.
Sure you're right.
Yeah. So it's
Kiss
interesting.
of death, isn't it?
Yeah, words like this, they move through communities now, and the most interesting part with our digital lives is that we get to watch that migration, and I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, we will stick with being demure, I think. This is just such a fascinating discussion, and it's such a cliche to say we could go on and on, but I always feel that with this event that we genuinely could have the most fruitful discussions for a long time. But this is the favourite bit of me anyway, which is where we actually ask for some questions from the audience, and hopefully we've had some coming in, and I think they will pop up on the screen. Yes, we do. This from Emily. How do you judge how successful the word of the year has been? Is it based on how long the word sticks around, the volume of media coverage, the quality of discussion? Well, we touched on some of those, Emily, but it's an excellent question. Fiona, to you first. How do you judge? How does anyone judge how successful it's been? If success is a valid criterion, really.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it could be any of these things, but also none of them. I would say if it gets people talking in some way, that's probably for me the bottom line. Even if that's for people to say, "Oh, I've never heard of it," because then they're discovering something new. And even if those, as Casper said, those people who perhaps originated it are now thinking, "Well, we don't want anything to do with it anymore." If it's word of the year, it's gone and it's left. So I think all of them definitely have you could say it's a factor, but really I just think it's if it speaks to people and resonates with them in some kind of way, then even if the conversation stops really quickly, it's still been a good chance.
It's had its moment, and I think if it reminds us of how passionate we all are about language, then it's doing its job.
That's a great thing, definitely.
Yeah, thank you for that, Emily. Right, on to our next question. From Sarah, when looking at data for word of the year options, such as an increase in usage, do you filter for usage generated by AI? That's an excellent point. Would such a data point be as significant as human usage? And is it even possible to distinguish? I don't know, of the three of you. Yes, Catherine, please help us with this one.
Also, I'll have a go at that one. So it's a great question, and I would say we monitor, so our corpus, we know what's in it, and we try to monitor it all the time for lower quality data that doesn't represent, because even before we had AI generated content, there are types of content like kind of formulaic press releases that we would deliberately exclude because they didn't seem like they were valuable examples of genuine human usage, even if strictly speaking they were. So that's something that we would, as part of our quality control, will be paying attention to that. I don't think it's something we've seen evidence of yet coming into our particular collection methods, but we'll definitely be alert to it and make sure that we're avoiding it, because we really, at this stage, we are defining the English language as the English language spoken and used by humans.
Yes. This is the challenge of AI Slop, right? I mean, it's one of the reasons that we have Slop on the list this year, is because it's creating all kinds of problems like this.
There's quite a lot of research going on at the moment in terms of identifying AI generated language, in terms of the particular vocabulary that it uses, its reliance on certain phrases, most of which I have to say I was encouraged to use when I was at school.
One of the ones that people always talk about.
Yes, and they are just sort of formulae and sort of padding, but I think there will be definitely more on that as we go along, obviously, because it's very much a wait and see, and we will try and stay ahead of the game. Thank you, Sarah. Right, our next question is from Sam. What are some of the more out there words that didn't make the shortlist this year? Fiona, one for you.
Well, I can't think of any that were necessarily out there, because I think if they'd been that out there, they probably would have been ones that stuck in our mind more. Sometimes it's I've already said there's nothing new under the sun, and it's the repurposing of some of these words. I'm going to steal, by the way, freshly retro as maybe a byline that you said, Casper, because I quite like that. Sometimes it's actually the more obvious ones that, so something like election, for example, we saw a lot, because not just in the US and the UK, but there's elections are held all the time. We saw some words like repechage used of the Olympics, and the reason we were seeing that more is because it was being used in events where previously repechage hadn't been used. I don't think either of those are particularly out there ones, but I think the out there ones are the ones that are more likely to end up going further and to making a shortlist. So it's really more of the not out there ones that I can think of as.
I also think there's something, this year we made a decision around, we've been saturated with political, particularly in America, with the election and things like this. And, there were words that would come up that, we thought about, like cat lady or, weird or things like this. But we didn't choose those for the short list. And, part of it also with the kind of putting your finger on the pulse of the word of the year isn't just kind of frequency and things like that, but it's, what do people want to engage with at the moment? And it feels like we're kind of exhausted right now. And our words of the year reflected some facets of the year that we thought people really would find engaging, would be really interested in that conversation right now. And so, it might not be that there's some out there words, but there are some words that, come onto the short list or onto the long list, and we have conversations around. And sometimes, some years, certain categories feel like it's a really timely thing to be on the list. You think about that climate change year with climate emergency, where all of the words on our short list, we chose climate words because we just thought, like, okay, that's capturing what people want to talk about right now.
Yeah.
And then other years, there's certain categories that you realize they just like, there's a lot of exhaustion, and it's really not going to be a word that people want to engage with if it's from a certain space. So these are all considerations that we have to think about as we're going through this process. It's one of the reasons that opening it up to the public is really helpful too on a short list, because you get a sense of where people are really interested in talking. And that definitely was the case last year, where Riz really started to take off when we realized there's a moment here that people want to engage with a word like that. I'm hoping this year, it'll be interesting. I was going to say, I hope that we have a clear winner, but however the process goes will be interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And also some of these leave a long footprint, because if you think about post-truth, from quite a few years ago, we are still talking about that. We're still talking about fake news, alternative facts, etc. Thank you for that, Sam. Okay, next one from Hannah. How do you think the word of the year will change in the future? Okay, that is a good one as well. Catherine, any views on this one?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I was thinking when we looked at the question about AI generated content being part of the corpus, and now I'm telling you, absolutely not. That would never be part of the corpus, because we don't consider it English if it's from humans. But who knows? 10 years from now, I would not make a prediction. Maybe things will evolve, and we will have neologisms created by AI, and they will catch on, and we'll decide, oh, actually, we really need to pay attention. So I think the only thing that I can promise is that it will change, as it has been changing, because just as the words that get used in a given year are a reflection of the preoccupations of that time, in a kind of meta way, the way that we're trying to handle our word of the year is also reflecting those changes that are happening.
Yes. Do you think it'll still be mediated by humans, however?
Well,
avatars.
Okay.
That's the key thing, isn't it? That no matter how much slop is out there, that actually there will be human input in terms of selection and sort of qualitative work. Thank you for that, Hannah. Okay, moving on to the next one. Thank you for all of these. They are really thought-provoking. Sheila, are we moving towards language being popularized on social media instead of discovering amazing word usage in literature? And again, that's a really good question, Casper, in terms of how much, we talked a little bit about the corpus, these fantastic billion-word databases, how much they are drawing on modern literature, maybe literature of the past, although they are predominantly current language, aren't they, that we're looking at for this?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at that corpus is really trying to focus on this past year, so those trends. But it's a really good question. I mean, look, when Catherine was talking at the beginning about what 2004 was like, we didn't have social media as a part of the corpus. There wasn't and that's grown in terms of the balance of the corpus. And so it's a good question. I mean, definitely social media is driving a lot of linguistic change. I said that before. It's such a connector, feature of our lives, our virtual lives now. And so, but I do think literature is something that continues to play with our imaginations and kind of capture who we are and who we're becoming in a way that does feel unique. And I think that we will always want to make sure that we're looking at that part of the corpus as well, to understand, how we're changing through the language we're using.
I agree. Fiona, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point to make about the difference between maybe coinage and popularization, because the thing I get asked quite a lot, or do we have more new words now than ever because of social media? And I don't know that we necessarily have more new words. Maybe there haven't been studies done on this now, but it definitely gives the chance for words to be popularized or amplified, or to just reach wider audiences so much more quickly. And that's really important. I mean, it's great for our research purposes when we're looking to be adding words to the dictionary, which is my day job. But it's a really great way of quickly being able to discover which languages and which types of language are being used in different places that you may have had to wait an awful long time previously to have actually discovered that. But there's always going to be a place for what you might call the more traditional places, like literature, like written down, published in the old. That sounds crazy to say, but the old sense. So I think the two things together are what will help to make make English, carry on and to be the living language that it is.
Yeah.
Thank you. We only have time for one question, but it's always such a good one. I'm just going to ask for your answers to be as brief as possible, if you can. This is from Joe. What is your favourite word? Catherine.
In the whole world. Wow.
It's an impossible question for lexicographers, but anyway, Catherine, if you can be brief, that would be great.
I can be brief because I'm completely, I was going to say I'm gobsmacked.
Let's go with gobsmacked. Rough date for that? I don't know. I'm thinking 19th century.
It'll be earlier than you think, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's very true. Fiona, what about you?
I do have one. It's mondegreen, which is a word for a misheard song lyric.
Yes.
And it goes back to the 1940s.
Misheard Scottish ballad line, wasn't it?
Exactly. That's older, but the word mondegreen itself, the 40s.
We built this city on sausage rolls. That's mine. Casper.
I don't know. I don't have a favorite word necessarily, but my favorite kind of cluster or source of words is Greek mythology and Roman mythology, in terms of these common usages like mercurial or Sisyphean or nemesis. That they all came from those our mythological Western history roots. I love those words,
and they have such stories.
Yeah, they're great stories.
I agree. Mine is something that does not characterize any of our audience today, or us indeed. This is nod crafty from a couple of 100 years ago, and that is nodding your head as if you understand everything that someone's saying when actually they tuned out hours ago. When you tuned out hours ago, none of us have been nod crafty. It's been a fascinating discussion. And thank you to everyone who has joined us. Thank you to our brilliant panelists as well. And over the next 2 weeks, you get to have your say about the Oxford Word of the Year 2024. Voting is open until 3 p.m. GMT on Thursday, the 28th of November. You can cast your vote on OUP's website via the link on the screen. And please don't forget to follow OUP to find out which contender will be crowned 2024's Oxford Word of the Year. As I say, massive thank you to our panellists, massive thank you to all those who submitted brilliant questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Voting is now open. That is the key thing to say. And yeah, here's to hearing what the final winner will be. Thank you so much to everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.